The Russian Revolution had many causes, but if we summarize them into three, the first is economic inequality, the second is political oppression, and the third is World War I.
The Russian Revolution was a complex event with many causes. However, there are a few key reasons why the revolution was ultimately inevitable. First was economic inequality. The Russian Empire was a very unequal society. The majority of the population lived in poverty, while a small elite controlled the vast majority of the wealth. Second was political repression. The Russian Empire was autocratic, meaning that the Tsar had absolute power. The people had no say in how they were governed, and they were often subject to arbitrary arrest and imprisonment.
Third was the First World War. The First World War was a major setback for the Russian Empire. The war was costly and bloody, and it led to a decline in the Russian economy. Russian society before the Industrial Revolution was a very different place than it is today. The vast majority of the population was rural, and the country was ruled by an autocratic monarchy. The economy was based on agriculture, and there was little industry.
The social structure was very hierarchical, with the nobility at the top and the serfs at the bottom. The serfs were essentially slaves, and they were bound to the land they worked on. They could not own property, and they were subject to the whims of their masters. Around the 19th century, when the Industrial Revolution spread throughout Europe, capitalism began to gradually spread to Russian society from the mid-1800s.
As large-scale factories entered Russia, which was an agrarian society, the domestic handicraft industries in rural areas collapsed and farmers' poverty began to increase. Then in the summer of 1891, Russia faced the worst drought ever and began to suffer from food shortages. As tens of millions of farmers suffered from starvation, which later spread into an epidemic, the people began to demand government countermeasures. However, Imperial Russia, despite severe famine, sold all its grain to feed peasants abroad and continued to delay a grain export ban bill. At the time, the Russian government held the position, we may not able to eat heartily. Nevertheless, we will carry out exports. They continued their absurd misstep, even creating a stupid slogan. In the end, the people who had turned their backs on the government were determined to solve the problem themselves. People engaged in public activity and discussions and pledged to join forces with each other. And over time, this wave of grassroots organization began to take on a political character little by little. Following heated debate on the causes of peasant poverty, Marxist criticism of capitalism, communism was accepted most widely. In this way, the socialist movement began to emerge little by little. In 1894, meanwhile, the liberal-leaning upper classes who had begun to step out to help the people submitted political demands to Russia's Tsar Nicholas II to solve various problems within the country. However, the Tsar suppressed all these popular opinions. and tried to keep his despotism that was going against the times. In fact, many of the political problems caused by the famine could have been solved relatively easily, but the Tsar's stubbornness aroused the resentment among the people and eventually fueled the revolution. The socialist movement that emerged after the Great Famine began to spread like wildfire because of the attitude of the Tsarist government, and socialist parties also grew rapidly. At the time, Marxist ideas gained persuasive power by arguing that the capitalist system caused these rural famines, and these ideas began to spread throughout the country. For reference, Lenin, who led the Soviet Revolution, was originally from the upper class. However, after his brother's death, while being implicated in a plot to assassinate the Tsar, he became steeped in Marxist ideology and began to become fervently involved in the socialist movement. In August 1903, the Social Democratic Labour Party, Russia's Socialist Party, split into two factions. At the time, the public opinion of the faction led by Lenin had a narrow advantage, which led Lenin to refer to his party as the Bolsheviks, meaning majority, and the opposition as Mensheviks, meaning minority. The socialist camp educated workers ideologically and prepared for a revolution that could begin at any time and place. However, there was one problem. At that time, Russian society was still a feudal society in which the capitalist system had not fully taken root. Therefore, before starting the communist revolution, modernization and capitalism needed to be properly developed. Socialists who believed in Marxist theory wanted to overthrow feudalism and despotism, the root of all evil. They ironically formed a united front with the liberals, who are completely opposite forces.
In the midst of such dissatisfaction with the authority of the Tsar, the Russo-Japanese War broke out in 1904. In the Russo-Japanese War, which began with a surprise attack on the Russian Navy by the Japanese Army, the Russian Army incurred a series of defeats.
The news that they were being defeated by a small Asian country gave the Russian people an indescribable shock. Public opinion deteriorated day by day, turning more and more against the Tsar. Liberal-leaning local self-government representatives used the government's mistake as an opportunity to introduce a resolution calling for parliamentary reform.
However, Nicholas II rejected several important proposals in the resolution. Thus, the Tsar evaded demands for political reform and thwarted the resolution, and the reforms of the liberals were again frustrated. Then, on January 9, 1905, workers' organizations suffering from exploitation at a factory staged a demonstration calling for labor reform led by Father Gapon.
Gapon led the workers to the plaza in front of the Winter Palace. Your Majesty, we are overburdened with heavy labor and insulted. We, our wives, our children, our elderly parents have come to you to ask for justice and protection, part of the petition. However, The Tsar was not at the palace at the time, and the army fired mercilessly on men, women, children, and the elderly, resulting in hundreds of innocent deaths. This incident was called Bloody Sunday. Until then, most people had a naive expectation that if they directly petitioned the Tsar about their difficulties, this representative of God would surely grant their request. However, due to the government's indiscriminate massacre, the image of the good Tsar, which many people had firmly believed in, was completely shattered. The terrible events of Bloody Sunday marked the beginning of a great coalition between the liberal and socialist forces. Liberals led the revolutionary movement, and socialist forces formed an alliance. College students and intellectuals gathered in protests. Workers across the country began to establish solidarity, and peasants began to rob landlords, set fire to mansions, and seize estates. The government dispatched troops more than 2,700 times from January to October 1905 to suppress peasant uprisings, and this endless mobilization accelerated soldiers' dissatisfaction. Even the majority of the dispatched infantrymen were conscript peasants, and in an ironic situation where peasants literally had to go to subdue other peasants, there were situations where an entire unit refused to obey orders. Rebellions began to break out even among the soldiers. Eventually, due to internal turmoil and military disobedience, the Tsar was no longer able to sustain the Russo-Japanese War. Russia had no choice but to admit a humiliating defeat to Japan. A nation always has internal enemies as well as external enemies. Russia's was an internal problem, namely the failure to pacify its people. The flames of revolution were growing, and the Russian Empire was on the brink of collapse. However, the Tsar seemed to be holding a tea party without even being aware of the situation. On September 20, 1905, all workers, including the most highly educated Moscow printers, went on a general strike. College students began to participate, and railroad workers, factory workers, shop workers, banks, office workers, hospitals, and even theater actors joined the strike. Although many socialists and workers participated, the initiative of the revolution came from the liberal forces, and the socialists had no objections. Then, on October 17, 1905, the government was paralyzed and fearful of losing the throne. Nicholas II finally proclaimed the introduction of civil liberties, parliamentary government, and universal suffrage. This decree was the October Declaration. The libertarian forces who had won freedom cheered, and many liberals withdrew from the revolutionary movement and began preparing for the upcoming elections. However, these results that only satisfied some factions eventually spawned other seeds of discord. The Tsar's October Declaration gave satisfactory concessions to the liberal upper class, but for workers and peasants, it addressed none of their issues, including working conditions, treatment, and wages.
Workers' strikes and rural uprisings grew stronger with each passing day, and on October 17th, the same day the Tsar issued the October Declaration, workers' committees, also known as Soviets, were established. It was the Soviet that would be the main axis of the creation of the Soviet Union in the future. During this time, Lenin was in constant struggle in Moscow. The Soviets wanted to launch an armed uprising to overthrow the current government by force, and the Social Democratic Labor Party issued weapons to the workers.
Beginning on December 10, 1905, about 6,000 workers revolted and fought fierce battles with the Russian army for a week. However, additional government forces arrived in Moscow and ruthlessly suppressed the workers through mass arrests and summary executions. Afterwards, the government quickly suppressed all revolutionary movements through the police and military, and the rebellious workers were put out of work.
The Social Democratic Labor Party went underground, and Lenin went into exile abroad in 1907. The parliamentary politics won by the liberals stabilized over time. In this way, the First Russian Revolution of 1905 came to an end slowly due to division among the liberal forces and oppression by the government. Thank you for watching the video, The Russian Revolution Part 1, provided by History and Current Events. Gina, Bella, Cindy, and Tony have contributed so far as narrators. Thank you.